The first measured century is made possible by T. Rowe Price Associates, an investment management firm providing mutual funds, brokerage services, and retirement plan services. T. Rowe Price. Invest with confidence. T. Rowe Price Investment Services, Incorporated.
We're Pfizer. We're looking for the cures of the future. Spending about $4.5 billion a year in search of new medicines for the 21st century. Pfizer. Life is our life's work.
The Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation. The Bernard and Irene Schwartz Foundation. The John M. Olin Foundation. The Smith Richardson Foundation. The D&D Foundation. By the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The 20th century is a closed chapter in American history. When we look back, what do we see? What are we shown? 1,000 stories of many heroes and some villains. Tales of momentous events that reshaped our world.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
But there is another way to view history. Over the past 100 years, Americans became the most ambitious measurers of human activity ever. Only now can we see long-term trends about everyday people, providing us with an imperfect method for solving problems, an ongoing series of great arguments, and a startling way of seeing America. This is the first measured century. Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg, moderator or immoderator of the weekly PBS series Think Tank. Welcome to our special, The First Measured Century, a look at American history by the numbers and the story of social science pioneers who, by measuring America, helped change it. Of course, statistics are used and abused on all sides of every argument. We'll show you the straightest numbers we can muster, but I urge you to look at the data here and to look further to websites and reference books. If you do, broad themes will likely emerge. Then you can call yourself an expert. Here's my take. America is an exceptional nation that has done remarkably well. Central to that success is the extension of liberty, the measurable expansion of personal, political, economic, and cultural freedom. That's a blessing, but sometimes perhaps a mixed blessing. Let's start. (1893), Chicago. Our story of the first measured century begins at a World's Fair celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival to what Europeans called the New World. For the 27 million visitors to the fair, it was a window to the near unimaginable changes to come in the next century. Like a giant department store where everything is bigger and better, the fair showcased the products of progress. There was the 22,000-pound block of cheese from Canada, and the world's largest cannon measuring more than 43 feet in length and weighing 132 tons from Germany. Measurement was in style. Numbers even defined the standards of beauty. Scientists compiled the measurements of 40,000 college students. Artists used the statistics to create these statues of the ideal man and woman. It was already clear that America would see the new century through data-colored glasses. Just outside the fairground, one of the great promoters of the day, William Cody, was staging a production of his own. 3 times a day Buffalo Bill's Wild West show celebrated the daring do of gunslinging cowboys and Indian warriors. For a new generation of Americans, this was as close as they would ever come to the legendary experience of the American frontier. While Buffalo Bill put tales of the heroic West on parade, a young professor came down to the World's Fair with a new way to tell the same sort of story, but with data. Frederick Jackson Turner from the fledgling University of Wisconsin presented his thoughts to the American Historical Association. His thesis would come to be called the single most influential piece of writing in the history of American history.
Turner starts this famous essay by quoting the Census Bureau, which interestingly in 1890 declares for the first time that there is no longer a visible frontier line on the demographic maps that the census is producing. Up until that time, if you drew a map of where people were and were not living in the United States and drew a line in areas that had more than 2 people per square mile or less than 2 people per square mile, there was a very clear demarcation between those two.
From 1790 on, that line had been moving steadily westward. Thomas Jefferson had speculated that to fill the vast open spaces of America, it would take 100 generations. It took about 80 years. By 1890, people had settled throughout the Western territories, and a clear frontier line could no longer be drawn.
Turner sees those maps and says, wait a second, something important's happening here. Something radical is changing in the nature of the American experience. The frontier line is ending, and therefore the first chapter of American history has come to a close.
Turner believed that creating a nation out of the wilderness yielded character traits that were unique to Americans.
Coarseness and strength, acuteness and inquisitiveness, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism which comes with freedom. These are the traits of the frontier. This expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnishes the forces dominating American character. Frederick Jackson Turner, 1893.
Turner grows up in this little town in central Wisconsin called Portage, and he tells the story of that town as a kind of microcosm of this American melting pot that he thinks of as the frontier. You can't actually read the Turner Frontier essay in 1893 without seeing that what he's really doing is taking the story of Portage, Wisconsin, and mapping it onto the American map, so it becomes the story of all of America.
Turner is picking up on an idea that is very much around. A lot of people are commenting on it. The frontier is closed. The country's industrializing. The place of the greatest growth, quite obviously, is in the cities. We're now becoming a country of cities and of bigger cities. Immigrants are pouring in from Europe, and there's all this concern. What's happening to us? What are we becoming?
Where now could the seeds of liberty be planted? For Turner, the frontier meant social and economic freedom, and he worried that with its closing, America would become more like Europe. Turner believed in what is now called American exceptionalism.
His emphasis on the frontier was an emphasis on something which he thought of as unique to the United States, and therefore helping to explain why the United States was a more egalitarian society, why it was a more open society, why there was more social mobility in it, and this in turn affected the class structure. And that, made Turner a social scientist, if you will, or closer to the ways in which social scientists operate.
Turner is important not just for what he said about America, but for the way he told the story.
Turner really is one of the very first American historians who conceives of his intellectual activity as a social science. He really does think of history as a problem-solving activity, not a storytelling activity. And so he draws from all sorts of sciences, natural and social, that are going on around him. And maybe one of the biggest influences on Turner is geography. He's in love with maps, and the application of maps as statistical tools, as a way not just of depicting information, but of analyzing information, is the heart of what Turner is about.
There was more information to analyze than ever before. The 1890 census that so influenced Turner asked more questions than any other before that time or since. Measurement magnified the impact that the infant social sciences would have on American life. Data would be at the core of the first measured century.
Turner is one of a new group of historians that emerges at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, who are vocal advocates for something that they call the new history. And that new history has a couple of characteristics. One is it is far more committed than any prior body of historical scholarship to social science analysis. It tries to use statistics. It uses the kind of data that historians had not used much up until that time in order to gain new insights and make new arguments. And then the other strand of the new history is those new insights, those new arguments, are pointed toward political interventions, very explicit political interventions, to say history can make a difference to policy. We can change the way we govern this country by using data in new ways.
Bella Boccia. So a new history based on data and social science was linked to politics from the very start. A social science controversy surfaced in a policy arena most Americans today would find antisocial and unscientific. For just as Turner was warning of the closing frontier, a new wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe was coming into neighborhoods like this one, Little Italy, here in Baltimore. The immigrants brought their languages, their cultures, and their talents. But at the turn of the century, a school of thought now called scientific racism used the tools of social science to label the newcomers as unfit for self-government, unable to become real Americans, and in fact, biologically inferior. Here's how the field of play was set up at the time. In January of 1892, the government opened a special building on Ellis Island to handle the massive numbers of new arrivals to the United States. Throughout the early 1800s, immigration rose and fell with the famines and wars of Europe. But starting at about 1880, there began an extraordinary migration on a scale unheard of before or since. By 1930, more than 28 million people immigrated to the United States. That's on a base population of only 50 million people in 1880. Each year between 1905 and 1907, more than 1 million people entered the country. At the peak of immigration, almost 15% of the national population was foreign-born. In many cities, immigrants made up more than 50% of the population. The American economy was usually booming, and workers came from all across Europe, drawn by the promise of jobs and by something else.
The overwhelming number of immigrants who came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were really in search of economic opportunity. But they were also concerned, and this was especially true of minority groups in parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, in political liberty. The ability to participate in the political system, to function in the world without the oppressiveness of a totalitarian regime. The pull of the United States and its attitude of religious liberty was very, very great.
Through the early 1800s, immigration to America had looked like this: primarily English, Scottish, German, and Scandinavian. But between 1880 and the 1920s, the flow changed. Eastern and Southern Europeans made the move to America in record numbers. Unlike the Scandinavian and German immigrant farmers of the 19th century, the new immigrants clustered in the cities. That's where the jobs were. Between 1880 and 1920, the cities expanded at a previously unimaginable pace. New York grew by more than 300%, Chicago 400%, Detroit 700%, and the real blockbusters were out west. Los Angeles grew by over 1,000% from a mere 50,000 people in 1890 to over 500,000 in just 30 years. These newcomers were often described by what they were not Protestant, not English-speaking, not skilled, not educated, and not liked. The newly arrived immigrants found themselves in a hostile and alien environment, in its way similar to the frontier described earlier by Frederick Jackson Turner.
For so many of these immigrants from Europe, they're coming from small cities or small towns, peasant villages, the shtetls of the Pale. They're hopscotching 2 or 3 centuries of history. Or, they're coming immediately into a strange new world.
Could the new immigrants adapt to life in America? Many learned men thought not, including Turner.
It is obvious that the replacement of the German and English immigration by Southern Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, and Slovaks is a loss to the social organism of the United States. The congestion of foreigners in localities in our great cities, the increase in crime and pauperism attributable to the poorer elements, all these are presented by this transformation of our immigration. Frederick Jackson Turner, 1901.
And Turner, it turned out, was a softy. Another prominent social scientist, Francis Walker, a superintendent of the census and later president of MIT, had this to say.
The entrance of such vast masses of peasantry, degraded below our utmost conceptions, is a matter which no intelligent patriot can look upon without the gravest apprehension and alarm. They are beaten men from beaten races. They have none of the ideas and aptitudes such as belong to those who are descended from the tribes that met under the oak trees of old Germany to make laws and choose chiefs. Francis Walker, 1896.
Good old democratic Germany.
We've come to think of race in this country almost entirely in the binary terms of black and white. But at the turn of the century, there were upwards of 36 in some schemes, 75 in other schemes, races. And the largest difference being the divisions within what we now think of as being one white race.
One scientist named William Ripley, believe it or not, identified a hierarchy of 3 fundamental white racial types in Europe by measuring head shape. The long-headed blonde Teutonic type, the short-headed brunette Alpine, and the long-headed dark Mediterranean, the Jews, Italians, Slavs, and Greeks. Surprised, the new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were ranked at the bottom of the scale.
This was the age of science, and science in this time, social science as well as physical science, measuring everything from heads to leg length to nose size, was used to bolster discrimination.
Now, in the United States, there was an increasing attention to eugenics, the belief that you could improve the human condition and improve human stock by careful breeding.
Improving the American breeding stock was the goal of a Chicago biologist named Charles Davenport. In 1910, with a grant from, of all places, the Carnegie Foundation, he established the Eugenics Record Office.
The population of the United States will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality. And the ratio of insanity in the population will rapidly increase. Charles Davenport, 1911.
For eugenicists like Davenport, race and character were fixed and immutable. Biology was destiny.
no matter how much philanthropy, no matter how much education, no matter how much learning and pulling oneself up by the bootstrap, they were confounded to some sort of state of inferiority.
Leading the opposition to this nativist view was a German Jewish immigrant who got his start in one of the coldest places on Earth. In 1883, a young scientist named Franz Boas traveled to Baffin Island in the Arctic Circle. While studying Eskimo customs, Boas began to develop one of the most important concepts in modern anthropology. At the time, tribal groups like the Eskimo were considered primitive and uncivilized. Northern European society was seen as the pinnacle of evolution, culturally, racially, and biologically. Boas wrote in his diary,
I often ask myself what advantages our good society possesses over the savages. The more I see of their customs, the more I realize that we have no right to look down on them. The idea of a cultured individual is merely relative.
In 1896, Franz Boas became one of the first professors of anthropology at Columbia University.
Franz Boas is affectionately known as the father of American anthropology. He has made a number of contributions. The first is delinking race from language and culture and making persuasive arguments that people and cultures do not go from savage, barbarian to civilized. Cultures are not better nor worse than any others. They're just equally complex and equally important on their own merits.
In 1907, Boas began an intensive study of close to 18,000 children of European immigrants. The results were published as Changes in Bodily Form, part of a 42-volume congressional study on immigration. Boas measured height, weight, head shape, and other physical traits, all cross-tabulated by whether his subjects were born in Europe or America, and how long they had lived in America. The results showed that in just one generation, the head shapes of children of long-skulled Nordic immigrants and those of the round-headed Slavic and Jewish immigrants were quickly becoming more like each other. In effect, once in an American environment eating an American diet, the children were physically becoming more like American children.
Boas was actually at a loss of words to really explain this, but he was demonstrating that the actual shape of people's bodies changed in the environment of the United States, which was actually quite profound.
And what that implies is that the hereditarians have it completely wrong. I mean, they're talking about immutable types. They're talking about unshakable characterology. They're talking about a kind of being, a racial being that's etched in stone that will never change. And he's saying, well, look right before your eyes, right here among these throngs that you're so worried about here in the New World, we can see changes, and quite rapid ones at that.
Throughout his life, Boas continued to argue that environment played a key role in shaping individuals. But eugenicists turned to another way of sorting out the races. In the early 1900s, the American scientist H. Goddard was in the vanguard of those promoting the newly invented intelligence quotient, the IQ test. Goddard outlined a scale of feeble-minded intelligence. At the very bottom were the idiots, barely able to function. Next came imbeciles, mentally 4 to 10 years old and capable of only simple tasks. And Goddard added another stage, just on the edge of normal intelligence, the moron.
The thing that made morons, in Goddard's estimation, so important is that morons were thought to be functioning enough that they could actually enter society and take part in society. as workers, as voters, and most importantly for Goddard, as procreators, as family members. They would be the mothers and fathers of the future generations of Americans.
In 1917, America entered the First World War. Millions of young men were mobilized to join the fight. Eugenicists saw an opportunity to gather a huge test sample. Lewis Terman of Stanford University convinced the Army that IQ tests could help sort the draftees according to their mental ability. Almost 2 million soldiers took the new tests. The written or alpha test included questions about American popular culture, the brand names of products, and even the location of a university. If the draftee failed the alpha test or was unable to read, he was given the verbal beta test. He had only a few minutes to look at pictures and draw in what was missing.
In looking at the intelligence tests, especially the verbal intelligence test, there was a tremendous cultural bias that was involved. Often an immigrant would be shown a picture of a tennis court and asked, "What's missing from this picture?" Well, if you're an Eastern European Jew fresh from the shtetl, you'd hardly be aware of the fact that there was a tennis net missing from the picture of the tennis court.
So scientific racism itself isn't new, but what is new in this period is the level of influence that science is having on policy debates and on policy itself.
Eugenicists seized on the Army IQ tests to prove to Congress that the races of Southern and Eastern Europe were a threat to the biological makeup of the nation. Henry Laughlin from the Eugenics Record Office testified before Congress that more than 75% of the new immigrants were feeble-minded. Based on such testimony, in 1924, Congress passed sweeping restrictions on immigration. The new law set quotas for incoming immigrants equal to 3% of the number of a given nationality living in America in 1890, 35 years earlier.
By going all the way back to 1890, it cut out from the calculations all of those millions who had arrived after 1890. What it does, in fact, is cut out exactly the people who eugenicists were the most afraid of. So while it's called a National Origins Act, it really is very much a Racial Origins Act.
Following the 1924 Act, immigration slowed way down until well after the Second World War. If many Americans didn't like immigrants, many immigrants did like America. Some, in fact, were ecstatic. In 1908, at the height of immigration, the most popular play on Broadway was called The Melting Pot. Written by Israel Zangwill, an immigrant playwright and political activist, it became a box office smash.
America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Here you stand, good folk, in your 50 groups with your 50 languages and histories, and your 50 blood hatreds and rivalries. A fig for your feuds and vendettas. Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making the American.
Zangwill knew what Franz Boas knew. In time, most immigrants become Americans. It has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with liberty. Okay, cue the babies. Smile, girls. Today, we take it for granted that kids like these will live to see their first birthday. But back in 1900, more than 1 of every 6 American infants, 1 in 6, died before the age of 1. And mothers were 100 times more likely to die in childbirth than they are today. Tuberculosis was the #1 cause of death for women. #2 was childbirth. In response to these frightening conditions, women activists rallied the nation to a campaign of reform. To make their case, they reached for the new tools of social science. We continue in Chicago, where in the shadow of the World's Fair, new immigrants were redrawing the face of the city. Between 1880 and 1900, the population of Chicago doubled and doubled again. The proportion of the city's residents who were foreign-born or first-generation American was 78%. Cheaply built tenements defined the landscape. Several families often crammed into a single apartment with little sanitation, ventilation, or sunlight. Disease often spread rapidly in the densely populated neighborhoods. The death of an infant from cholera, tuberculosis, and even simple diarrhea was a common fact of life. Horrified by the conditions in the city, small groups of university-educated women began volunteer organizations called settlement houses. These dormitory-like homes provided a place where middle and upper-class women could live and work in the heart of the poorest city neighborhoods.
The voluntary efforts were a way that women were encouraged to identify the city as their larger home. And it was a path into civic improvement and civic activity for women, because if they treated the city as a place that they were responsible for, they had to keep clean, they had to keep healthy for the benefit of their family members and the community as a family, that gave them opportunities for public actions that they didn't ordinarily have.
One of the first and most important of these settlement groups was Hull House in Chicago. It was founded in 1889 by the 29-year-old daughter of abolitionists, Jane Addams.
The streets are inexpressibly dirty. The number of schools inadequate. Sanitary legislation unenforced. Hundreds of houses are unconnected with the street sewer. The older and richer inhabitants seem anxious to move away as rapidly as they can afford it. They make room for newly arrived immigrants who are densely ignorant of civic duty. Jane Addams, 1891.
For the next 45 years, Addams led Hull House in aiding and educating their immigrant neighbors. One young boy who took his first music lessons at the settlement house was the son of a poor Jewish tailor, Benny Goodman. In 1893, Hull House was hired by the Illinois Bureau of Labor to gather statistics on wages. The women canvassed the entire neighborhood, door to door, with a detailed survey. The collected data formed the basis of a landmark book, Hull House Maps and Papers, published in 1895. Using detailed, color-coded maps, the volume breathed life into dry statistics.
And the map showed you, for any building, the wages of the residents in that building, and then another map showed you the nationalities of the people in that building. So you could look and see block by block, even building by building, where wages were falling out and which nationalities were stacked next to each other in this ward.
The nationalities map showed 18 different ethnic groups in the 1/3 square mile neighborhood around Hull House. Italian families, marked in blue, clustered to the north, and Poles and Russian Jews, noted in red, lived to the south. The neighborhood even had its own red light district. The lots in white indicated brothels, most of which were occupied by native-born women, both white and black, not by immigrants. The wage map showed the average income in the area was only about $7 a week. That's like a family at the end of the 20th century living on about $7,000 a year. The lots in black show that most Italians made less than $5 a week and were unemployed much of the year.
And one of the things that the women at Hull House were very anxious to demonstrate was that the people in their neighborhood were not vicious, that they were not drunken, lazy bums, but were impoverished because of low wages, because of the conditions in which they worked.
They thought that poverty was not a result of sin, but rather a result of social conditions, and that it was society's responsibility to address poverty, both the living conditions and health and welfare.
Hull House maps and papers used data to make a case for political action. Social measurement helped turn an emotional plea into a focused argument for reform.
They don't care that people should use that information to spin theories, sociological theories. They're not interested in theories. They're interested in solving social problems. And so women social scientists were continuing a tradition of sociology, of economics, of political science, of social science in general, outside of universities. And that stream of social science thought, that stream of social science practice, continued to marry moral imperatives to the collection of data.
But according to some social scientists, this was not a marriage made in heaven. They said that if the new disciplines were to grow and remain credible, morality and emotion had to take a backseat to science. It was the president of the American Sociological Society who made the most passionate case against passion.
Thinking must be freed from the bias of emotion. There must be eliminated all the associations that disturb the connection between the thinking and the data. William Fielding Ogburn.
Ogburn had refined his views while teaching at the two institutions that led the way in the new field of American sociology, Columbia University and then the University of Chicago, just a stone's throw away from Hull House, at which he occasionally threw stones.
Desire has a strong selective influence in causing particular data to be noted and other data not to be noted. Theories suggested by such facts have a strong probability of being untrue in varying degrees, offering false solutions.
But for Jane Addams and the women activists, collecting data was more than just an academic exercise. Women did not have the national right to vote. Numbers were a source of power. Armed with statistics, women's groups mobilized across the country.
There were millions, literally millions of women involved in progressive reform activities in the early 20th century. Women not only in the settlement movement, but women in organizations like the General Federation of Women's Clubs, in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Daughters of the American Revolution, some groups that we much later would associate with conservatism, not progressivism, were in the early 20th century very much a part, in fact central, to progressive reforms.
And in 1912, Congress created the Children's Bureau under the Department of Labor. Jane Addams and her network of women's groups persuaded President William Howard Taft to appoint a woman as chief of the Bureau. Julia Lathrop became the first woman to head a federal agency. One of the original residents of Hull House and a co-author of Maps and Papers, Lathrop firmly believed in the power of data.
We do not know how many children are born each year, or how many die, or why they die. We need statistics of nativity and mortality. Homeless and neglected children are going to be better cared for, because we're going to do more for all children as we begin to know more about the problems of childhood in general. Julia Lathrop, 1912.
The Children's Bureau studies revealed that infant death was often caused by unsanitary conditions, contaminated water, and by the lack of adequate health care. In homes without running water, infant deaths were 40% higher. And as the father's income fell by half, infant mortality doubled. Lathrop searched for an approach that would be both helpful and politically feasible.
She decides that the education of pregnant women and new mothers would be one of the ways that she might help to decrease infant and maternal mortality. So she mounts an educational campaign to help women learn about the value of prenatal care, for instance, about the kinds of nutrition that pregnant women need to have, the kinds of exercise that they need to have in order to have a healthy delivery. And she mounts an educational campaign about the healthiest ways to raise babies.
Lathrop rallied her grassroots network to lobby for an expansion of the Children's Bureau. And in 1920, Congress passed the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act. It would become a model for much of the social welfare legislation of the 20th century. Itinerant nurses sought out pregnant women and new mothers, setting up wellness tents, examining babies, and educating their mothers. Women's groups spread the gospel of cleanliness, proper feeding habits, and the need to seek out a doctor or clinic for advice. Women's club members went door to door to measure infant births and deaths, and then compared the results to local records. They showed that infant mortality had previously been greatly underestimated.
One of the remarkable things about Julia Lathrop's procedure was the degree to which she involved women in local organizations. She was creating a demand for the collection of statistics. She was involving grassroots people who had no training themselves in academic social science in the collection of social data, and so was giving that method a kind of authority in American life that it simply had not previously had.
Social science measurement passed the test of political power. It worked. We can now look back and see what happened over the century. In 1900, for every 1,000 births, 165 babies died. By 1930, that rate had dropped by more than half, and it kept going down. By the end of the century, only 7 babies died for every 1,000 born. Over the course of the century, life expectancy at birth increased from 47 years to 76 years. A baby born at the end of the century will typically live 50% longer than an infant born in 1900. A similar trend was apparent among new mothers. In 1900, for every 100,000 births, about 850 mothers died from problems related to pregnancy and childbirth. Today, for every 100,000 births, there are 8 deaths. Thank you, Morris. Why don't they let me drive once in a while? Well, life was getting better for babies and for moms and for most everyone else. Henry Ford advertised his new Model T as stronger than a horse and easier to maintain. In the early part of the century, the mass-produced automobile and a blizzard of other new machines were dramatically changing the way Americans lived. The industries and inventions that arose in the 19th century had mostly provided the building blocks of America's infrastructure: steel, canals, railroads, oil, coal, and of course, Big Daddy, electric power. That tree of infrastructure bore fruit. The 20th century was to be the consumer century, hailed by most, scorned by some. In 1900, there were only 8,000 cars in the entire country, owned, naturally enough, by the very rich. But by 1925, a new Model T was rolling off the assembly line every 15 seconds. By 1930, there were more than 26 million cars, used by about half the population. Thanks largely to Henry Ford's use of standardized parts and the assembly line, costs fell, even as wages rose throughout the country. Before World War I, a car cost the average American worker the equivalent of 24 months' wages. By the late 1920s, a car could be purchased for about 3 months' wages. By 1928, more than 3/4 of all the cars in the world were in America. Notwithstanding this outpouring of consumer goods, the American economy remained volatile. Since the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution, swings in national production marked repeated cycles of booms and busts, of panics, small depressions, and periodic high unemployment. In 1919, unemployment and inflation prompted more than 2,000 strikes across the country, involving more than 4 million workers. What to do about this growing rift? John D. Rockefeller Jr., billionaire son of the founder of Standard Oil, believed that the key was religion. In the spirit of the time, he sought data and funded a survey of religious attitudes. The young man chosen to head the study was not a social scientist, not yet. He was a social activist, Robert Lind. While training to be a minister, Lind lived and worked in the difficult conditions of an oil camp in Elk Basin, Wyoming, owned by Rockefeller's Standard Oil.
My dad, after his summer in Elk Basin, published 2 articles in which he criticized the long hours, the low pay, the social isolation. And in fact, the story at our family table was that he wrote a letter to John D. Rockefeller Jr. and asked him for a contribution to the project of building a community center for the women in Elk Basin. The story is that John D. Rockefeller replied and said that Standard Oil had had a hard year and he wasn't in a position to contribute.
Despite young Bob Lind's public attacks on one of the most powerful men in America, or perhaps because of it, he got the job. Lind's new wife, Helen, a graduate of Wellesley College, joined him in the investigation. Together, the Linds searched the Midwest for a sample community that they hoped could represent mainstream America. In 1923, they found what they were looking for in Muncie, a small city of 38,000 people in Lind's home state of Indiana, 40 miles to the northeast of Indianapolis. Their subsequent book, a smashing bestseller still in print, would be called Middletown, and it would make Muncie the most studied community in the world.
They wanted a place that was as unexceptional as possible, with nothing outstanding about it. And that is true of Middletown to this day. That was what they liked about it. They were looking for, in a sense, the essence of plain Americanism.
The Linds arrived in Muncie in January of 1924. As they put it, they set out to observe Munsonians as an anthropologist would study a primitive tribe.
He refused to study religion as a thing in itself. He took the position that it could only be understood as part of the entire life of the community. The folks who were paying for the study were very dissatisfied with this. They thought it was a waste of time. They thought it wasn't going anywhere. And my dad had a tough time sticking to it.
They took up residence in Muncie and tried to become part of the fabric of the community. It was a conservative culture. It was a community that reflected the influence of late 19th century Southern attitudes. The Linds had a series of questionnaires where they would survey the attitudes of high school students, they would survey the attitudes of housewives, they would survey the attitudes of the people on the street. No one had done a small city survey of the type that the Linds proposed to do.
Several survey questions measured patriotism in Muncie. The Linds showed high school students the statement that the United States is unquestionably the best country in the world. More than 90% of the students agreed. Clearly, they believed that America was a most exceptional place. Robert and Helen Lynn tried to capture how life in a small heartland city had changed between 1890 and 1925. To establish their timeline, the Lynns used data from Census Bureau records along with the personal recollections of Munsonians drawn from hundreds of interviews. They made long lists of goods that could be found in the home of 1924 that were unheard of in the Muncie home of 1890. A furnace, running hot and cold water, indoor plumbing, toasters, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, telephones, refrigeration, fresh fruit all year round, a greater variety of clothes, and by the way, cigarettes. What the Lynns saw in Muncie was happening across the nation. The portion of American households owning flush toilets more than doubled in 10 years. Less than 1% of homes had central heating before 1920, but by 1930 the figure was above 40%. By 1930, 1 in 4 homes had a washing machine. The number of households with radios climbed from 1% to 40% in a single decade. Telephones quickly spread from only 5% of households in 1900 to 41% in 1930.
The 1920s were a very important decade in the rise of consumer society in America. Unmistakably an inflection point. Not in terms of the production of the goods or the existence of the goods, but in terms of the actual acquisition of those goods by millions of households.
The Lynns observed how new technology and new consumer goods were transforming everyday life in Muncie. Consider the movies. Within 3 decades of the invention of moving pictures, 70% of Munsonians went to the movies at least once a week, and almost half went 2 or more times. 80% of high school boys and 70% of high school girls went to the movies more often without their parents than with. The Lynns concluded that movies were transforming leisure time from a family activity into an individual one. Some high school teachers thought moving pictures were bringing about the early sophistication of their students. In the Lynns survey of housewives, mothers worried about how the changes affected their children.
Girls aren't so modest nowadays. They dress differently. It's the girls' clothing. And we can't get our boys decent when girls dress that way.
Telephones gave Americans greater liberty of communication. For young people, a phone could be a more private way of approaching the opposite sex.
Girls are far more aggressive today. They call boys up to try to make dates with them, as they never could have when I was a girl.
The Lynns also saw how cars affected behavior. Sometimes mobility also means privacy. One Middletown judge told the Lynns that cars were houses of prostitution on wheels. The Lynns noted that movies and the automobile were changing the nature of the predominantly Christian town. The Sabbath was becoming the Sunday holiday. Church attendance fell to almost half of what it had been in the 1890s.
What the Lynns saw in Muncie, that they later became very critical of, was this all too vigorous embrace of the consumer society. The Lynns were very critical of advertising and of the manipulation of people's attitudes and beliefs. And of course, much of the 1920s prosperity was conditioned by advertising. The Lynns were very much critical of this mentality that was taking place in America, where personal possessions were valued more than personal relationships.
The Lynns saw the new consumer economy as contributing to a growing division in society it would become the most controversial aspect of their work.
They discovered the scandal of class. Most Americans at the time had been brought up to believe that we live in a democracy where everybody's essentially equal, though admittedly some people are richer than others. The Linds discovered in Middletown that there was a business class, as they called it, and a working class, and that they were as different as two different tribes. Their conditions of life were different, their values were different, their expectations were different, and there wasn't, they thought, much passage between the two.
The Linds identified 70% of Munsonians with jobs as working class. That is typically factory or construction workers, those that made a living working with things. The other 30% belonged to what the Linds called the business class. These were the people who worked with ideas or with other people, developing, promoting, and selling services. This difference, according to the Linds, affected every aspect of life in Muncie.
What distinguished the working class and the business class was not level of income necessarily, rather it was security of employment. The business class were people who had long-term secure employment prospects. The working class, the much larger category, were people who could not count on stable employment and had no protection against unemployment, no substantial savings, no unemployment insurance plans, and so on. So their lives, the working class lives, were characterized by volatility and insecurity to a degree that simply wasn't true of this other category of people.
When the Linds published Middletown in 1929, it was an instant hit. They had tapped into Americans' growing love affair with data. Critics took a variety of messages from the Linds' work.
There's a great debate, I think, that quietly but consistently rages about whether the rise of consumer society has been on net a good thing for Americans or not. Americans have voted with their feet. I think it's hard to see a lot of commerce as anything but, at some core level, a set of elections. No one forced Americans to buy movie tickets or mass-produce lipstick from Max Factor or baked beans. They chose to do that.
The Linds focused on class differences just when class itself was changing.
They're looking at two processes. One is they show class to us, working class, business class, but the other is the progress of modernization. And the progress of modernization actually muddies up the class distinction that they want to make. People are getting washers and refrigerators, indoor plumbing. We have cars, not for all the lower class, but everybody's thinking about getting a car if they don't have one.
Case in point, the rich man's car was likely to be luxurious and perhaps chauffeur-driven. But a working-class car performed exactly the same function. It took a passenger from point A to point B faster, easier, and cheaper than a horse and buggy. All car owners enjoyed an increase in their liberty of mobility. Like the car, many of the new consumer goods were liberty multipliers. Call them liberty machines. The radio and the movies let middle-class folks hear and see the same entertainment as rich people. The telephone, once a rich man's toy, provided the liberating force of communication for millions. Middle-class women may not have had servants, but washing machines and vacuum cleaners could offer the liberty of time off from housework. Now, I think the Linds were great sociologists. They reported on modernization and on the availability of consumer goods, but they had big problems with that. By my lights, what the Linds didn't quite get is that consumer goods were eroding class differences and actually leveling the playing field. As the 1920s moved to a close, the American economy was booming. Things looked good for most Americans. The new president, Herbert Hoover, commissioned a vast study called Recent Social Trends. He hoped that it would do for the entire nation what the Linds had done in Muncie.
The fact that Herbert Hoover, of all people, commissioned this group of social scientists to write recent social trends is a reminder that Hoover comes out of this older progressive tradition of looking to social scientists and looking to reliable data as a way of making political policies.
When it was finally published in 1933, Recent Social Trends ran to 1,700 pages, 29 chapters, and 2 volumes. To this day, it remains revealing reading. It used statistics to describe how America had changed between 1890 and 1930. The president of the American Sociological Society, William Ogburn, was in charge of research. Ogburn, recall, had criticized activist sociologists like Jane Addams. In Recent Social Trends, he tried to completely separate social science from politics and ideology, with mixed results. Among the top social scientists chosen for the study were Robert Lind, only months after the publication of Middletown. One of the few women to work on the project was Julia Lathrop's protege at the University of Chicago, Sophonisba Breckinridge. In a chapter on women's activities outside the home, Breckinridge noted a shift we often think started only recently. Between 1900 and 1930, the percent of married women who work doubled, rising from 6% to 12%. Looking at the American family, William Ogburn noted a familiar-sounding trend. The divorce rate was on its way up. It doubled in 30 years.
Our culture may be conducive to further increases in divorce unless programs are instituted to counteract this tendency. If present trends continue, 1 in 6 marriages of the present year will end in divorce. William Fielding Ogburn, 1933.
The report also looked at the impact of the new immigrants on society. The ideas of scientific racism still influence the dialogue.
As soon as any agreement can be reached about the method by which undesirables can be selected from the population, they should be prevented from propagating. Warren Thompson.
Recent Social Trends was published in 1933, but it was no longer of use to Hoover, who had been voted out of office, held accountable for the onset of what would become America's greatest depression. The worst was yet to come. We've become accustomed to the images of bread lines, the apple sellers on the corners, but pictures cannot begin to capture the depth of the crisis. For that, we need to look at the desperate numbers of devastation, and we will. But first, consider one story that has come to epitomize the Depression experience, the tragic saga of the Dust Bowl migration to California. Most everyone who thinks about American history thinks they know this one cold. It was first immortalized by the memorable photographs of Dorothea Lange and others. John Steinbeck's classic novel, The Grapes of Wrath, and the movie that followed have been etched on American chords of memory. Steinbeck's heroes, the beaten-down Joad family, became stand-ins for the 375,000 Okies and Arkies who headed west in the 1930s. Many of them came across the desert on Route 66 through these mountain passes, seeking the lush San Joaquin Valley. Who were they? What really happened to them? As Americans were told over and over again, these were uneducated, dirt-poor refugee farmers blown away by the Dust Bowl, pushed to California to work as peasant pea pickers, facing harsh white-on-white racism, right? Well, to begin, take that matter of the Dust Bowl itself.
So much of what we think that migration was all about is wrong, starting with the name. The whole concept of a Dust Bowl migration is a wonderful misnomer. Most of the people had nothing to do with the Dust Bowl region. Most really weren't victims of the drought either. A lot of them weren't even farmers.
There was indeed a Dust Bowl, but almost all of these migrants came from areas well to the east of it, mainly from parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and Arkansas. And most did not match the demographics of the Joad family of Steinbeck's novel. Less than half the migrants, just 43%, were farmers or farm laborers. Almost 1 in 6 was a professional, a proprietor, or a white-collar employee. About 2 in 5 were blue-collar workers. Accordingly, their prospects differed from those of the Joads.
About a third went into the valleys of California that are associated with the Grapes of Wrath, 2/3 into the cities, especially Los Angeles, where they found industrial jobs, and some of them were white-collar workers. So the imagery is misleading. It's much too negative. It creates an impression of great misery when there was certainly difficulties, and there were people who suffered tremendously. But the majority story is much more positive.
For most people, even the journey itself, the great westward exodus, was not the hard road described in Steinbeck's novel.
This wasn't covered wagons. This was 2 days with camping along the way or stopping at motels in Arizona. And for many people, not unpleasant days at all, any more than it is today. For those who ran out of money, of course, there could be difficulties. But for most people, it's just a drive.
It's not that families like the Joads didn't exist. They did. And those were real people that Dorothea Lange captured on film. But artists and the media often shape their data, just like social scientists. Some of the rural Okies and Arkies faced deep-seated discrimination and scorn when they arrived in California. But perhaps they had the last laugh. They brought their country culture with them, which has survived and flourished in California, across America, and around the world.
And Muskogee, Oklahoma, USA.
The Okies and Arkies were not the only people who picked up and moved, fleeing the hurricane of the Depression.
The 1930s is the only decade for which we have numbers from the 18th century forward when net migration to the United States was negative. People actually left the country.
Several 100,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans also left the United States. Some unable to find jobs in Depression America or facing widespread discrimination saw greater opportunity back in Mexico. Others were repatriated, often against their will.
The Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in American history by a very large margin. And it's almost impossible to convey the dimensions of such a terrible economic crisis.
The best way is with data. They tell a story beyond anything we've experienced in recent times. Take unemployment. From 1950 to 2000, the annual unemployment rate never even hit double digits, and when it got close, it was only briefly. But from 1930 to 1940, for more than a decade, unemployment in America averaged 18%, and it never dropped below 14%. At its worst, in 1933, the unemployment rate was 25%.
In that era, the typical household had only one wage earner in it. So when we talk about 1 in 4 people being unemployed, we're really talking about 1 in 4 households in the country with no visible means of support, no reliable income. Today, the typical household has 2 wage earners in it. So even a 25% unemployment rate, God forbid that we should ever see it today, would not mean the same thing in human terms as it did in 1933.
The Depression hit almost every sector of the economy. 1/3 of American farmers lost their land from 1929 to 1932. Housing starts plunged by almost 90% between 1929 and 1933, and they wouldn't rebound for almost 15 years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average also plunged by almost 90%. Total wages dropped 60%. As we now measure it, more than half of all Americans were living in poverty.
This was a desperate time for families because unemployment was so massive and so long-term, and because there was no effective source of relief for unemployed people during much of the 1930s.
The most intimate areas of American life were affected. From 1929 to 1933, the marriage rate fell by 22%. Many young people could not afford to leave their parents and start their own households. At the same time, the divorce rate dropped by 25%. If you were already in a household, you couldn't afford to set up a second one. The birth rate declined by 15%. Another mouth to feed? Those numbers measure the hardship of the time, but they had a lasting impact. This crisis was so extreme that it brought forth powerful remedies.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal introduced major federal programs for relief and recovery, many of which are still with us today. Social Security, unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, the minimum wage, stock market regulation, federal deposit insurance for banks. The New Deal marked a radical change in the role of the federal government.
Calvin Coolidge once said that if the federal government went out of business tomorrow, the average American wouldn't notice the fact for at least 6 months, which was a pretty true statement, actually, because in the 1920s and before, the federal government's role was essentially to deliver the mail and service the national debt such as it was and make a few payments to veterans, and that was about it.
Prior to the Great Depression, the public at large generally accepted the view that government was a problem, not a solution. The Great Depression changed that because it was so widely interpreted as reflecting a failure of the private enterprise system. And as a result, the attitude of the public toward government changed. It changed from believing it was a problem to believing that government was a solution to every problem.
What did Americans of the 1930s think about the government's increased role in their lives? Previously, we would not have been able to answer that question with any certainty, but the mid-1930s saw the advent of another institution that boosted liberty and has stayed with us to the present day, the public opinion poll. In 1935, a new weekly column appeared in newspapers across the country. America Speaks promised to report what the public thought about the issues of the day through nationwide public opinion polls. The surveys were conducted by a Princeton, New Jersey company called the American Institute of Public Opinion, recently founded by George Gallup. The issues were wide-ranging, from manners and morals to the most profound debates about public policy. For example, was it indecent for women to wear shorts on the street in 1939? 63% of respondents said yes. What about topless bathing suits for men? Apparently they were okay, although 33% still found them indecent as late as 1939. Did Americans approve of a married woman working if she had a husband capable of supporting her? No, and by a wide margin, 78% disapproved in the Depression year of 1938. As for what Americans thought about the Depression and the New Deal, the poll offered some real surprises. For example, in retrospect, it's commonly thought that Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal programs were wildly popular. But the very first Gallup poll question in 1935 was this: do you think expenditures by the government for relief and recovery are too little, too great, or just about right? How do you think Depression-era America answered? Too little, 9%. About right, 31%. Too great, 60%. But just 3 months later, in December of 1935, Gallup was in the field again with this question: are you in favor of government old age pensions for the needy? Yes, 89%. No, 11%. Americans wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and why not? It's a pattern that continues to the present day. Now, George Gallup did not invent the modern public opinion poll, but he is the man who legitimized it, thanks in part to a dramatic bet. In 1935, in order to get newspapers to subscribe to his weekly polls, Gallup promised he would predict the winner of the 1936 presidential election.
He actually guaranteed the newspapers that were subscribing to his poll that if he was wrong, he would refund all their money. Now, that was a lot of polling that he had been doing that whole year, so for him to agree to refund the money if he was wrong was a real big gamble.
And that was just part of the bet. Gallup also guaranteed that he would predict the percentages more accurately than the leading poll of the day, conducted by the Literary Digest magazine. It seemed a foolhardy promise. The Literary Digest poll had picked the winner in every presidential election since 1916. The Digest poll was conducted on a vast scale. A staff of several thousand workers stuffed ballots into envelopes, in some years as many as 20 million of them. The ballots were mailed to names pulled from automobile registration lists and telephone directories.
As a matter of fact, they went to about a third of all households in the United States. And the assumption was that more people you interview, of course, you're going to get more closer to the truth.
But George Gallup knew that huge samples did not guarantee accuracy. The method he relied on was called quota sampling, a technique also used at the time by polling pioneers Archibald Crossley and Elmo Roper. The idea was to canvass groups of people who were representative of the electorate. Gallup sent out hundreds of interviewers across the country, each of whom was given quotas for different types of respondents. So many middle-class urban women, so many lower-class rural men, and so on. Gallup's team conducted some 3,000 interviews, but nowhere near the 10 million poll that year by the Digest.
So a lot of politicians at the time said, how can you believe George Gallup? I know the Literary Digest is polling because I know of people who've gotten the ballot, but I never see a George Gallup interviewer.
Both predicted big wins, but for different candidates. The Digest predicted Republican Alf Landon would win handsomely with 57% of the vote to Roosevelt's 43%. Wrong, said Gallup. He forecast a win for Roosevelt with 54% of the vote. When Election Day arrived, voters filed into the voting booths and re-elected Roosevelt with an overwhelming 61% of the vote. George Gallup won his bet. How could Gallup be right and the Digest so wrong? The Digest's automobile registration lists and telephone directories were not representative samples. In the 1930s, while cars and telephones were becoming more widespread, they were still disproportionately owned by the middle and upper classes. That hadn't mattered much in previous elections. The voting patterns of rich and poor were similar. But in 1936, in the Depression, more prosperous Americans tended to vote Republican for Landon, and less prosperous voters tended to vote Democratic, favoring Roosevelt. Since Gallup's samples more closely matched the electorate as a whole, his numbers were less affected when the vote split along class lines. It was a turning point for Gallup and for polling.
I would say that the 1936 election really put the so-called scientific pollsters on the map. My father, George Gallup, Archibald Crosley, and Elmo Roper, because it was a very dramatic demonstration of the power of the accuracy of scientific polling versus other kinds of surveys that relied on sheer numbers or samples that weren't representative.
The Literary Digest went out of business. Gallup became the leading evangelist for the new science of polling. In his 1940 book, The Pulse of Democracy, Gallup outlined a utopian view of its potential. Polling, he said, would become the national equivalent of the New England town meeting. It would give a voice to the views of the common man.
My dad thought that polls were absolutely vital to a democracy. He felt that polls were extremely important because they removed the power from lobbying groups and from smoke-filled rooms and let the public into the act. It was a way to let the public speak.
I think he'd still say, if he were around, he'd say, although it's being overdone now, you still have to know who the public is. I mean, this is what a democracy is about. Without it, what do you have?
Has Gallup's vision been realized? We are told politicians aren't leaders anymore, they just echo polls. But for all its flaws, public opinion polling is a great American contribution to democracy. Would you rather live in an America where politicians don't know what's on the mind of the public? Barely half of Americans vote for the president, while public opinion polls theoretically represent the views of all citizens. Polling helps give democracy a voice, which was what Gallup had in mind. When we come back in a moment, we will see democracy itself under the gun during the greatest calamity of the century.